40 below zero. Not the kind of cold that makes you reach for a sweater. Not the kind that frosts your windshield on a slow November morning. This is the cold that kills without warning. The cold where exposed skin dies in under 4 minutes. Where a single deep breath feels like swallowing broken glass. Where the air itself becomes a weapon pressing against your chest with the weight of something ancient and merciless. Scientists will tell you that at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature of the Great Lakes winter matches the surface of Mars on a warm afternoon. The forest does not forgive. The forest does not wait. And yet, inside a structure built from nothing but bent sticks and tree bark, no metal, no electricity, no modern insulation of any kind, 100 people are barefoot. They are sharing a hot meal. They are laughing. How did the Haudenosaunee build a wooden machine that could hold back a Martian winter with nothing but saplings and elm skin? How did they keep 10 fires burning in a sealed hall without turning it into a death chamber? And how did the architecture of survival, bark walls, bent wood, shared fire, quietly become the blueprint for one of the most sophisticated systems of governance the ancient world had ever produced? And here is the question we will carry with us until the very end. Why did the most powerful democracy of the ancient world begin not in a marble hall, but in a house made of bark? This is the story of the Longhouse, not just a shelter, a living machine. And it begins, as all great things do, with a walk into the deep woods, and the wisdom to choose the right tree. Long before the first snowflake touched the frozen ground, the survival of an entire village began with a single, deliberate choice. The men did not search for the giants of the forest, not the ancient oak with its cathedral arms, not the massive maple standing proud at the ridge. Those trees were too sure of themselves, too rigid, too proud to bend. Instead, they looked for the young ones, the saplings. Hickory and cedar, no thicker than a man's wrist, but tall and arrow straight, still carrying the memory of growth in every fiber. Trees that had not yet forgotten how to move. They fell these young guardians with rhythmic strikes of stone axes. The sound was not the sharp crack of modern steel. It was a dull, wet thud that echoed through the morning woods like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. The smell of fresh split wood rose into the cold air, green and alive, like the earth exhaling. The secret was in the timing. By harvesting in late spring, the builders caught the tree at its most yielding moment, when the sap was still running, when the wood was not yet a dead thing but a coiled spring, loaded with invisible energy. They stripped the bark away to reveal the pale, damp surface beneath, cool to the touch, smelling of deep soil and new rain. Then came the act that separated shelter from genius. 2 rows of poles were driven deep into the dark earth, standing like soldiers facing one another across a wide aisle. Men climbed wooden scaffolds, grabbed the tops of the poles with both hands, and pulled, slowly, carefully. This was a dangerous dance. Pull too fast and the pole would snap with the sound of a breaking bone. Pull with too much force and it would whip back like a weapon. But when the tension was exactly right, something extraordinary happened. The wood began to moan, a low, living sound, half protest, half surrender. And inch by inch the pole curved over the central aisle until its tip met the tip rising from the opposite side. They were lashed together with long, wet strips of inner bark, strips that would shrink and harden as they dried, locking the joint in a grip that no nail could improve upon. When the work was done, the skeleton of the Longhouse stood against the winter sky, a barrel-vaulted series of wooden ribs, curving overhead like the belly of a great whale resting on the forest floor. The oak fights the wind and breaks. The sapling bends and outlives the storm. The Haudenosaunee had understood something that modern structural engineers would spend centuries rediscovering. Flexibility is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. Once the skeleton stood, it was time to give the wooden whale its skin. But this was not work that could be done in any season. The elm tree, the giant whose bark was thick, rugged, and naturally waterproof, would only surrender its outer layer in spring, when the sap rose close to the surface and loosened the bond between wood and bark. Come back in summer, and the tree would hold its skin like armor. Come back in winter, and the bark would shatter like frozen leather. Spring was the only invitation, and the Haudenosaunee knew better than to arrive uninvited. They did not fell the elms. They approached them the way you approach something you respect, carefully, with precision. Long vertical cuts, careful horizontal ones at top and bottom. Then, with practiced hands, They peeled away sheets of bark as long as a grown man is tall. The sheets came away heavy and wet, smelling of deep earth and something older than memory. To the Haudenosaunee, this was not raw material. This was the earth's own leather. Each sheet was laid flat on the ground and pressed under heavy stones, coaxed into flatness before it could curl and harden in the drying air. When ready, the sheets were hoisted up and lashed to the wooden ribs in overlapping layers, starting from the ground and working skyward, each row covering the seam of the one below. Exactly like the scales of a fish, exactly like the shingles on a modern roof, a design so efficient that rainwater and snowmelt would slide harmlessly down the walls, never finding a seam, never touching the families inside. A second layer of poles was then added to the outside, sandwiching the bark between two wooden lattices. The result was a wall that was simultaneously light enough to be built by hand and strong enough to resist the lateral force of a Great Lakes blizzard. In the 1990s, researchers studying indigenous architecture found that this double lattice bark system could bear wind loads comparable to modern timber frame construction, and it did so without a single nail, a single bolt, or a single piece of metal of any kind. The Longhouse was not built against the elements, it was built from them, but the skin alone could not keep 100 people alive through 6 months of killing cold. For that, the Haudenosaunee turned to fire, not one fire, 10. Spaced evenly down the central aisle of the Longhouse, 10 hearths were dug directly into the packed clay floor, each one shared by the two families living directly across from one another. The wood was always seasoned hardwood, hickory and oak, chosen for its slow, intense burn and its reluctance to throw sparks into a bark-lined hall. And here is where the Longhouse reveals its first great paradox. 10 open fires, no windows, a roof sealed against rain and snow. By every modern calculation, this should have been a death chamber, the smoke alone enough to suffocate every soul inside within the hour. But the builders had not miscalculated. They had designed for exactly this. Directly above each hearth, a rectangular opening was cut into the roof, and outside, long poles were used to angle large bark flaps, adjusting them against the direction of the wind, the way a sailor adjusts a sail. When the wind blew from the north, the northern flap dropped and the southern one rose. The result was a gentle, constant suction, a vacuum that pulled smoke upward and outward, while simultaneously preventing snow from falling in. It was ventilation engineering, in bark and wood. Centuries before the concept had a name, but not all the smoke was meant to escape. Because the roof was a high, curved vault, a thick layer of warm gray smoke settled permanently in the upper third of the interior, sitting at roughly 7 feet above the floor like a low ceiling of warm fog. This smoke layer acted as a thermal cap, trapping the rising heat from the fires and reflecting it back down toward the people below. To move through the Longhouse was to pass between two entirely different worlds. At eye level, clear air, warm and breathable. Reach your hand above your head, and it would vanish into a dense, pungent cloud of gray. But smoke was not the only invisible force at work inside these walls. The builders understood. There was something else, something that no one had named yet, but everyone could feel. Along both walls, raised a foot or more above the cold clay floor, ran wide wooden sleeping platforms, stretching the entire length of the building. These were covered first in thick mats woven from corn husks, then layered with the heavy, oily furs of black bear and beaver. Beneath the platforms, firewood was stacked in careful rows, slowly baked dry by the nearby hearths, so that every log thrown onto the fire was already bone dry before it burned, releasing its maximum heat with minimum waste. But the most remarkable heat source inside the Longhouse was not the fire at all. A resting human body generates approximately 80 watts of thermal energy, the same as an incandescent light bulb burning continuously through the night. 100 bodies, packed together inside a sealed bark tunnel, produce the equivalent of 8,000 watts of steady living warmth. Enough, according to thermal calculations, to raise the interior temperature by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit before a single log touches the fire. The Longhouse did not heat its people heated each other. And lying there on a raised platform, wrapped in the weight of bear fur, listening to the breathing of your family rising and falling in the warm dark around you, this was something that no number could fully measure. This was the feeling that every human being, across every century and every culture, has quietly searched for without always knowing its name. The certainty that you are not alone in the dark. The Longhouse did not just solve the problem of cold, it solved the problem of loneliness. While the men moved through the forests, the interior of the Longhouse belonged to someone else entirely. Not a chief, not a warrior, not a king seated on a carved throne behind walls of stone. A grandmother, sitting on a raised platform in the dim amber light of a midwinter afternoon, her fingers moving with the quiet certainty of someone who has never needed to prove her authority, drawing a bone needle through soft deer hide, stitching a pair of moccasins that would carry a child through their first winter. Around her, the other women worked in the synchronized rhythm of a household that had learned, over generations, that cooperation was not a virtue, it was a survival strategy. This was the clan mother, and in a world that history has often forgotten to look at carefully, she was perhaps the most powerful political figure the Longhouse produced. She decided how food was distributed, who ate first, who ate more, who received the last of the dried corn when February stretched longer than expected. In a space where 20 families shared a single hallway with no private walls and no private fire, this was not a small power. This was the power of life. When disputes arose, and in quarters this close, they always did, it was the clan mother whose voice settled them. Not with force, with memory, with the quiet authority of someone who remembered every winter that had come before this one, and knew which decisions the community had survived and which ones it had not. But her power did not stop at the bark walls. It was the clan mothers, not the warriors, not the hunters, who selected the men who would represent their nation in the Great Council. And if a leader grew selfish, or hungry for war, or stopped listening to the people he was meant to serve, it was the clan mother who removed him. Centuries before the Magna Carta was signed in a muddy English field, centuries before the philosophers of the Enlightenment began writing about checks on power and the accountability of leaders, the Haudenosaunee had already built the answer, not into a legal document, but into the architecture of daily life. You cannot have a private fire in a longhouse. You share it. You cannot have a private wall. You share it. You cannot hold power without the consent of the women who tend the hearth, because it was always their hearth to begin with. The Longhouse did not just shelter a democracy. It manufactured one hearth fire, one shared meal, one quietly spoken decision at a time. In the quietest corner of the Longhouse, near the platform where the clan mother slept, were objects that carried more weight than any beam or rafter. Not weapons, not tools, belts. Wampum belts, intricate tapestries woven from purple and white shell beads, harvested from the distant Atlantic coast, and carried inland through networks of trade that stretched hundreds of miles. In a world without paper, without ink, without an alphabet of any kind, these shells were the writing system. Each pattern, each row of beads, each deliberate shift from white to purple was a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter of living history. One belt might record the terms of a peace treaty between nations. Another might carry the memory of a great famine, the winter when the corn ran out before February did. Another told the story of a messenger, a figure the oral traditions call the peacemaker, who is said to have traveled in a canoe of white stone to bring an end to the generations of war tearing the 5 nations apart. Historians and oral tradition scholars continue to debate the exact moment this story became governance. The dating of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the political union of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, remains a subject of genuine scholarly discussion, with estimates ranging from as early as the 12th century to as late as the 1600s. What is less disputed is what they built, one of the most sophisticated systems of collective governance in the pre-colonial world. The peacemaker's symbol for this union was not a flag, not a crown, not a throne. It was a longhouse. He told the 5 nations that they were no longer separate peoples living in separate structures. They were one family, living beneath a single invisible roof that stretched across their entire territory. The Mohawk stood at the eastern door, the first to face the rising sun and any danger coming from the sea. The Seneca kept the western door. The Onondaga sat at the center, tending the great council fire, the hearth that belonged to everyone and to no one. Some historians, including scholar Donald Grand and others who have studied 18th century political correspondence, have argued that this structure, this idea of federated nations sharing power beneath a common roof, left visible fingerprints on the thinking of those who later designed the United States Constitution. In 1988, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution formally acknowledging the influence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on American democratic ideals. The full extent of that influence remains debated among historians, but the connection, at minimum, deserves to be named. The children who sat in the Longhouse during those long winter nights did not hear these stories once and move on. They heard them every winter, for their entire lives, whispered from the sleeping platforms, told over the cooking pots, debated around the council fires, repeated until the story was no longer something you learned. It was something you became. This was the true genius of the Longhouse's architecture. Not the bark, not the bent wood, not even the smoke layer holding the heat above the sleeping families. It was the fact that everyone lived together. There were no private rooms in which a story could be forgotten, no separate houses into which a child could retreat and never hear the history of their people. The architecture of shared space ensured that the culture was a shared one, repeated, reinforced, and kept alive by proximity alone. The Longhouse did not just preserve memory, it repeated it, season after season, until the story became the child. There comes a moment in the deep middle of a Great Lakes winter when the world outside appears to simply stop. The wind reaches a frequency so high, it becomes a single sustained note, not a howl but a whistle, thin and endless, pressing against the elm bark walls like something that has been searching for a way in for a very long time. Inside, the families are asleep, but the Longhouse is awake. You can hear it if you listen, a language of low groans and soft pops moving through the hickory lashings as the blizzard slams against the eastern wall. The wooden ribs, those saplings bent with such care in the warmth of spring, flex under the weight of the wind. Not dramatically, not violently, just enough. The slow, almost imperceptible lean of something that has learned not to resist what it cannot stop. A house of stone would crack. A house of heavy timber would groan and split at the joints. The Longhouse leans into the storm. The bark scales shift slightly against one another, absorbing the blow the way water absorbs a stone, closing around it, swallowing it, releasing it, then springing back. If you were to wake in the deepest hour of that storm, you would see the hearths reduced to low beds of deep red embers, the air around you still and warm, the smoke layer above you like a dark ceiling holding the cold at bay, and all around you on the platforms the soft, rhythmic breathing of the people you have shared every meal, every fire, every story with for your entire life. The cold searches for a way in. It finds the base of the walls where bark meets earth. It tries the smoke holes in the roof. It meets the rising column of heat from the embers and retreats. The two forces, the killing cold of the open forest and the living warmth of the hearth, press against each other at the thickness of an elm bark wall, and for 6 months, every winter, the bark holds the line. In this moment, the Longhouse is not a building, it is a heartbeat, and outside, at 40 below zero, the world is trying to stop it. A Longhouse was never truly finished. Every spring, as the ice began to crack and groan on the rivers, that deep, prehistoric sound of a frozen world remembering how to move, the people would climb the exterior lattice and inspect what the winter had taken. Bark sheets scorched thin by the rising heat of 10 hearths, sections battered brittle by the weight of 1,000 snowfalls. These were removed carefully, replaced with fresh, supple sheets harvested from the willing elms of the new season. The old bark was never discarded. It moved to the lower walls as extra windbreak, or down into the storage pits beneath the sleeping platforms. A broken sapling rib was pulled free and fed into the nearest hearth, one last offering of warmth from a piece of wood that had spent years holding the cold at bay. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was finished. Nothing was permanent. And that was not a flaw in the design. That was the design. But eventually, even the most carefully tended Longhouse would begin to feel the weight of time and use. The firewood grew harder to find, requiring longer journeys deeper into the forest. The soil in the surrounding fields worked season after season to produce the three sisters. Corn, beans, and squash would grow quiet and pale, the stalks coming up shorter each year, as if the earth itself was asking to be left alone for a while. When this happened, the Haudenosaunee did not force the land to give more than it had. They listened to it. They dismantled the Longhouse with the same care they had built it, carrying the strongest poles, the finest bark, the wampum belts, and the council fires to a new place where the soil was deep and the forest was willing. What remained was left without ceremony, without grief, without the human need to mark the place as something that had once mattered. Within a few years, the forest would return. Saplings would push up through the packed clay of the old floor. Vines would reclaim the fire pits. Rain would soften the remaining bark until it folded back into the soil it had once come from. No monument, no ruin, no trace, just a forest, slightly richer than it had been before. And perhaps that is the answer to the question we carried with us from the very beginning. The question of why the most powerful democracy of the ancient world began not in a palace of stone, not in a hall of marble, but in a house made of bark. Because bark, unlike stone, knows when to let go. The Haudenosaunee did not build to last forever. They built to live well, and to leave the land better than they found it. In a world that measures greatness by what survives, they measured it by something quieter, by how little destruction they left behind, and how gracefully they disappeared when it was time. That is an architecture no building can fully contain. It lives in the decision to bend instead of break, in the choice to share a fire instead of guard one, in the grandmother sitting by the hearth, holding the power to end a leader's rule with nothing louder than a quiet word. It lives in every human community that has ever understood, even briefly, even imperfectly, that survival was never an individual achievement. It was always a shared one. In our next journey, we leave the frozen woodlands behind. We travel to a world where the sun does not set for months, where the ground beneath your feet has not thawed in 10,000 years, and where another people discovered that the most sophisticated shelter ever built was not constructed above the earth, but carved from within it. The fire is still burning. We will see you at the next hearth.